So I have a bit of a confession before I start. I have stolen the title of my story from a workshop that I went to a couple of months ago, which was called The Alchemy of Loss. And it was just a phrase that really resonated with me, because I think in grief and in loss there's something really golden to learn about ourselves and just about humanity. So thank you whoever named that workshop, because I think it's a beautiful title, which isn't mine, but I stole it. So my story is about my relationship with my dad. And my dad was a paranoid schizophrenic, he was an alcoholic, he was violent, he was nasty, he was a bully, and he ruled us kind of really tyrannically as I was growing up. So my overriding memories of my childhood are that of fear, like a constant fear, and shame. And the fear was daily, even if there was a good day that there was no kind of violence or bullying, you were scared that that would happen, so the fear was always there. And the shame kept me silent. So the shame made sure that I didn't speak about this, that I was too embarrassed or too ashamed to really voice it. And I blamed myself. I thought just the pure act of being there meant it was my fault. I'm the youngest, I have an older brother, and so I just imagined that they had a life that was happy before I arrived. And as a child, that made me introvert, which is probably quite surprising to anyone who knows me, because I'm not at all introverted at this point in my life, but I totally tried to disappear and become a nothing and a silent. And I just wanted to blend into the background. And then as I grew older and I left home, the opposite happened. This shame and this fear manifested itself in extroversion, and so I became really loud and would be the life and soul of every party, always wanted to be the last person standing. So the manifestations were different, but the root was the same. And that's kind of how I see my life. As a child I didn't know how to play, and so as an adult I really tried hard to play, but always filled with shame, always shamed. And in my late 20s my dad was sectioned, which was when we found out, so my brother and I found out that he was paranoid schizophrenic. He had been diagnosed years before. He'd had electric shock treatment, but we were never told. And he never medicated himself, so throughout my life he numbed himself through the alcohol. And rather than numbing him, the alcohol actually brought out the worst in him, and so made him much more violent and much more aggressive. And in my late 20s, when I found this out, I'd probably been quite estranged from a lot of my family for a while, so not totally apart, but really not involved with them at all. And suddenly I felt guilt, because he had a reason, and he had a humanity, and he had a sadness, and he was whole. And in his wholeness, he didn't know how to be a person. And he didn't know what he was doing was impacting us in this way. He didn't understand, he couldn't see beyond his own paranoia. And the paranoia was big, like it was really big, and that was always apparent. But having this kind of medical explanation made me feel like I again was even more to blame, that I should have been understanding, and that I should have helped somehow. I don't know how, but I felt that there was something I could do. And so for a while I tried really hard to have a relationship with him that was one of me caring. And while he was medicated, so while he was taking his pills, and they were really strong pills, like he had pills to counter other pills to counter other, he had loads. And you could see he was a man on drugs, like his movements were slow, he would gurn, he would clearly be really doped up, but I liked him like that. And I know that people have like a morality or moral issues with drugs in that sense, but I quite liked him like that. And I didn't really want him to stop, because we were having a relationship. And there was still fear, and there was still shame, but there was also love, because he is my dad, or he was my dad. But most, I assume that all mentally ill people, but most definitely at some point stopped taking their pills. Because I think with paranoid schizophrenics, they basically don't believe that they're ill. And so he would on occasion stop, and he would stockpile them, and then the abuse would come again. And because he was older and more frail, it would be verbal, not always physical, or never physical at that point, but it was still as hurtful, if not more so. So the words were like punches. It didn't make it any less than the fear that I felt as a child, and the shame that I felt as a child. But then, as a process of stockpiling the pills, he would take an overdose, and so it would start again, and the cycle would go back, and my feelings of guilt and shame and fear would take me back to wanting to be his son. And that cycle happened for however long, almost a decade. And it got to a point where I was like, I can't be in this anymore, and I have to just totally remove myself from a relationship with him at all. And at this point, everybody else in his life had already walked away. So all of his friends, all of his family. So I was his last connection, his last family member, his last friend. But I had to walk away because I couldn't take it anymore. And I basically put myself down to be his next of kin because I thought that was the least I could do. Then the home that he lived in would contact me if anything happened. So I would know, and I could be a son from a distance. I could no longer be a son up close. Fast forward to the beginning of 2015, and he is moved from the home that he was in, which was sheltered flats, into an actual home. But nobody told us, so we didn't know. In fact, no one rang me. And then on the 1st of July that year, I get a phone call telling me that he's dead, and that he'd actually died on the 31st of May. But what had happened was, in the process of moving him, they had lost my details. And so I get this phone call, and obviously, still not having dealt with my shame, suddenly I feel guilty and I feel complicit in his death, because I could have phoned once a month and spoken to a woman. I didn't have to speak to him, I could have known what was going on. And I just basically felt like I had some part to play in this still. And then from that I started having panic attacks where I would literally be out on the street and would black out and turn up somewhere 2 hours later not having a clue how I got to this place, or I would physically vomit. And all these kind of real physical manifestations of my body just shutting down. I couldn't open a letter or read an email, I just couldn't understand simple things. And totally guilt and shame at this point still. Totally blaming myself and not really understanding how to get out of that cycle at all. And then I went to see him dead, so I went to see his body. And as I stood there over his body, he was in a coffin, and he basically looked like he was gasping for breath, so his eyes were so shut, his head was kind of sticking up and to the left and his mouth was open. And I walked in and I thought he was alive, like it looked like he was just going to breathe and then his body was going to come back down. And I said, "Dad," expecting something to come back, and it didn't. And in that moment I looked at him and he was tiny and he was small and he was old and he was dead. And I was scared. I was still really, I had this fear. And at that point of looking at him and feeling that fear still, I don't know what it was, but something happened where I knew I didn't have to be scared anymore. And I knew that he couldn't do anything anymore. And also in that moment of death, like I knew that he was a human. And actually it wasn't shame or guilt that I needed to feel for him, but compassion. And it wasn't really my fault, none of this. The fear fell away at that point. And I left. And on that day, I suppose I began a journey that was coming to myself, a real sense of myself, someone who wasn't the introvert or the extrovert, but something in between, who needs both of those energies. The experience of going through all the panic attacks and the blackouts and the vomiting kind of took me to a place where actually, what is there to feel shame for? And I started to try to be more resilient to my own self. and try to actually just allow people to come in more deeply and intimately into me. So rather than disappearing when things got tough or really playing out, just staying. And for me, the alchemy of the loss of my father is really the alchemy of my creation, because what I discovered actually was that by opening up, by getting to a point of being really connected to people, I could be resilient to the shame. And where that then brings me is to be able to stand here really and share this kind of intimacy with everybody here, to actually open up and really, really show who I am or what I've been through, as opposed to kind of playing it quiet or playing it hard. So yeah, thank you.